Officer Jameson sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel as he scanned the streets. The neighborhood was quiet, but to him, it was the kind of quiet that signaled something was about to go down. His partner, Kyle, a fresh-faced rookie barely 6 months into the job, sat beside him. Kyle had learned to sit in silence during these patrols, absorbing the tension that seemed to roll off Jameson in waves. "Keep your eyes open, kid," Jameson muttered, his voice a low growl. "This area might look calm, but it's a cesspool. You can't trust anyone out here." Kyle nodded, though he didn't entirely agree. He'd grown up in a town not far from here, in a place not much different from the one they were patrolling now. His father had been a police officer too, but he had taught Kyle a different lesson: protect the community, serve with fairness, and never forget that the people you police are still human beings. But saying that to Jameson felt dangerous, almost like it would spark a conflict Kyle wasn't ready to have. They drove in silence for a few more minutes until Jameson's eyes locked on a sleek black sedan rolling slowly down the street. There was nothing obviously wrong, no broken taillights or erratic driving, but Jameson's radar went off. "Look at that," he said, his voice thick with suspicion. "Probably a dealer or some wannabe gangbanger. You see that car? Too nice for this part of town." Kyle glanced at the car. It was a clean, expensive model, the kind that stood out in a neighborhood like this. But nothing about it screamed criminal to him. Still, Jameson's tone left little room for discussion. "Let's pull him over, see what this guy's up to," Jameson decided, flipping on the lights before Kyle could protest. The siren pierced the quiet evening, and the black sedan smoothly pulled over to the curb. As they came to a stop behind the car, Kyle felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This didn't feel right, but he wasn't sure how to voice his concerns. Jameson had been on the force for over 2 decades and had a reputation for being tough but effective, especially in neighborhoods like this. He wasn't the type of cop who welcomed questions from rookies. The driver's side door of the sedan opened, and a tall black man stepped out, dressed in a well-fitted suit. His movements were calm, unhurried, as if he had no reason to be concerned about the 2 officers approaching him. Kyle watched as the man stood by his car, hands visible, his face composed, but unreadable. "Evening, officer," the man said politely, his tone neutral. "Is there a problem?" Jameson walked toward him with a swagger, the kind of heavy confidence that came from years of feeling like he owned the streets. He gave the man a once-over, his eyes narrowing as if sizing him up for trouble. "License and registration," Jameson snapped, ignoring the man's question. "What are you doing driving around this part of town?" The man raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained calm. "I wasn't aware I needed a special reason to drive in any part of town, officer." Jameson didn't like that. Kyle could see his partner's jaw tighten, the faint spark of anger flickering in his eyes. Jameson leaned in closer, invading the man's personal space. "You look a little out of place," Jameson said, his voice low and threatening. "Fancy car like this? It doesn't fit. Where'd you get the money for a ride like this, huh?" The man's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle tension in the air now. "I work for my money, officer. Is there a reason you're asking me these questions? I've given you no reason to suspect me of anything." Kyle shifted uncomfortably, feeling the situation escalating too quickly. This was just a traffic stop, but Jameson was pushing it further, and Kyle wasn't sure why. Or maybe he was sure, but didn't want to acknowledge it. He swallowed hard, watching as Jameson's hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching close to his baton. "Let me search the car," Jameson demanded, his tone brooking no argument. The man hesitated. "I don't consent to a search," he said firmly, though he remained calm. "I've done nothing wrong." Jameson's lips curled into a smirk, the kind that sent a chill down Kyle's spine. "You think you've got rights out here?" he asked, leaning even closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you can just say no?" Kyle's heart raced. This was wrong. He knew it, and he had to say something. But before he could speak, Jameson motioned toward him. "Kyle, get over here and check the car." Kyle froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't disobey a direct order, but everything in him screamed that this was wrong. Jameson was clearly profiling this man, and now he was pushing the boundaries of the law. Kyle's mind flashed back to his father, to the lessons he'd been taught about doing the right thing, no matter the cost. But this was real life, and the stakes felt impossibly high. Reluctantly, Kyle moved toward the car, his mind racing for a way out of this situation. As he opened the door and began a cursory inspection, he heard Jameson mutter something under his breath. When Kyle turned back, he saw Jameson slipping a small baggie of what looked like drugs into the passenger seat, his actions quick and practiced. Kyle's stomach dropped. His partner was planting evidence. This wasn't just a bad traffic stop anymore. This was corruption, plain and simple. Kyle's hands shook as he stepped back from the car, trying to figure out what to do next. He couldn't believe what he just witnessed, and yet here it was, playing out in front of him like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Jameson turned to the man, his smirk widening. "Look what we've got here," he said mockingly, pulling the baggie out from the seat. "Drugs, huh? Guess you're not as clean as you think." For the first time, the man's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his voice, still calm, took on an edge. "I don't know what game you're playing, officer, but I suggest you rethink your next move." Jameson's laugh was cold. "Is that a threat?" "No," the man said quietly. "It's advice." Kyle's mind raced. He was on the edge of something huge, something that could destroy his career before it even began. He could stand by and let this happen, like so many others before him, or he could take a stand. But what would that cost him? His job? His future? Maybe even his safety? He glanced at Jameson, who was already preparing to arrest the man, and then back at the man himself, who remained eerily calm despite the injustice unfolding before him. Before Kyle could make a decision, the man spoke again, and this time his voice carried an authority that cut through the tension like a knife. "Officer, I think you've made a mistake. My name is Marcus Hayes, and as of this morning, I'm the new captain of this precinct." The air seemed to freeze. For a moment, neither Jameson nor Kyle spoke, the weight of the revelation crashing down on them both. Jameson's smirk faltered, his eyes flickering with confusion and doubt. Kyle felt his heart stop. This man wasn't just another driver. He was their superior, their new boss, and Jameson had just tried to frame him. Jameson's bravado slipped as the reality of the situation dawned on him. His face twisted in disbelief, but it was clear he was trying to calculate a way out of this. "You expect me to believe that?" he sneered, though there was a noticeable crack in his voice. "You don't look like a captain to me." "Ah!" Marcus pulled out his wallet and flipped it open to reveal his badge and ID. "Believe it," he said, his voice hard as steel. "And you've just crossed a line you can't uncross." For the first time in his career, Jameson looked unsure, but his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. "This is some kind of setup," he spat, though his words lacked their usual force. "You're trying to play me." Marcus took a step forward, his eyes locking with Jameson's. "The only one playing games here is you, and this one is over." Kyle could feel the ground slipping beneath his feet. Everything was unraveling so fast, and he knew he was standing at a crossroads. What he did next would define his entire career, maybe even his life. His mind raced, the weight of his father's lessons pressing on him. He couldn't stay silent. Not now. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Kyle stepped forward. "He's right," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "Captain Hayes is telling the truth, and what you did, what you planted in that car, it was wrong, Jameson." Jameson whipped around, eyes blazing with anger and betrayal. "What did you just say?" Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground. "I said what you did was wrong, and I won't be a part of it." The silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath of that night rippled through the police department and the community like a stone dropped in still water. Officer Jameson, who had once swaggered through the precinct with the air of untouchability, was now the subject of an internal investigation. His suspension had been swift, and with each passing day, the weight of his actions dragged him further into a public disgrace that even he couldn't talk his way out of. Kyle walked into the station the morning after the incident with a knot in his stomach. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. Whispers buzzed around the room, officers murmuring about what had happened. Some had already heard the details, the story spreading through the station like wildfire. Others simply exchanged glances, knowing something monumental had taken place, though they weren't sure of the specifics. Kyle wasn't a hero in their eyes, far from it. He was seen by some as a traitor, a rookie who had sold out a senior officer. The brotherhood of the badge ran deep, and to some, what Kyle had done was the ultimate betrayal. To them, Jameson might have had his faults, but he was still one of them. And Kyle? He had crossed the unspoken line. As he made his way to his desk, Kyle could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. Officers who had once been friendly now gave him cold, distant looks. A few muttered under their breath as he passed, their words barely audible but laced with disdain. He could almost hear what they were saying. Rat, snitch, rookie with no loyalty. The department was like a tight-knit family, and Kyle had broken one of its cardinal rules. He sat down at his desk, trying to focus on the paperwork in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. Images from the night before replayed in his head. The confrontation with Jameson, Marcus Hayes revealing himself as their new captain, the moment Kyle had finally spoken up. He felt a strange mix of relief and regret, unsure if he had done the right thing or if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had stood up for what he believed in, but at what cost? Across the room, Marcus Hayes entered the station. The moment he walked in, the room fell silent. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere as every eye turned toward him. He was a tall man with a quiet, commanding presence. And now, with his new position officially announced, he carried the full authority of the precinct with him. The officers who had doubted him, who had whispered behind his back about how he didn't fit the mold of a police captain, were now forced to reckon with the reality that he was in charge. Kyle glanced up, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Marcus's. The captain gave him a small nod, acknowledging the role Kyle had played in exposing Jameson's corruption. It was a gesture of respect, but also one of solidarity, an unspoken understanding that they were both now on the same side of a war that had been brewing within the department for far too long. As Marcus made his way to his office, the room remained eerily quiet. The unspoken tension hung in the air, thicker than ever. The officers were waiting to see what would happen next. Would Marcus sweep the whole thing under the rug, or would he follow through on the promise of reform that had been whispered about since his appointment? Kyle couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Meanwhile, Jameson was far from accepting his fate quietly. Rumors had already started to circulate that he was pulling every string he could to get back on the force. His suspension, while humiliating, wasn't the end in his eyes. He still had allies in the department, cops who shared his worldview, who believed that policing meant maintaining control over the streets by any means necessary. They saw Jameson as one of their own, a casualty of political correctness gone too far, and they were more than willing to defend him, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the evidence mounting against him. The media had gotten hold of the story too. Local news outlets ran headlines about the racist cop who had tried to frame the new black police captain. The public, already on edge from years of strained relationships with law enforcement, reacted with outrage. Protests were small but vocal, with community leaders demanding not just Jameson's dismissal, but a full investigation into the department's practices. It wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. It was about the culture that had allowed someone like Jameson to thrive for so long. Outside the station, people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "End police corruption." It was a scene that had played out in countless cities across the country, but now it was hitting home, right here in their precinct. And Kyle, for better or worse, was at the center of it. Inside the station, the divide between officers grew wider. There were those who quietly supported Kyle and Marcus, who believed that the department needed to change, that the old ways weren't working anymore. But they were a quiet minority keeping their heads down, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Then there were those who stood by Jameson, either out of loyalty or because they shared his prejudices. These officers weren't shy about making their feelings known, and their resentment toward Kyle was becoming more obvious by the day. For Kyle, each day felt like walking through a minefield. Every interaction with his fellow officers was fraught with tension, and he found himself constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Would someone confront him outright? Would they try to sabotage his career in more subtle ways? He didn't know, but the uncertainty was wearing him down. One afternoon, while Kyle was sitting at his desk, trying to focus on his work, a veteran officer named Ruiz approached him. Ruiz had been on the force for nearly as long as Jameson and was known for his no-nonsense attitude. He stood by Kyle's desk, his arms crossed over his chest, and stared down at him with a look that made Kyle's stomach churn. "You think you did the right thing, rookie?" Ruiz asked, his voice low but full of menace. "You think you're some kind of hero for turning on your partner?" Kyle swallowed hard, meeting Ruiz's gaze but feeling the weight of the accusation pressing down on him. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice steady but quieter than he intended. Ruiz shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Right, huh? You think the rest of us don't know what goes on out there? You think we don't know how to do our jobs? Jameson's a good cop. He's been cleaning up these streets for years while you were still in high school. And now you come along and you want to tell us how to do things?" Kyle didn't know how to respond. He had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "I'm just trying to do what's fair," he finally said. "What Jameson did wasn't right." Ruiz leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're not gonna last long in this department if you keep thinking like that, kid. You better watch your back." With that, Ruiz turned and walked away, leaving Kyle sitting there, feeling more isolated than ever. He had expected some pushback, but now it felt like he was standing alone in a room full of people who saw him as an outsider. But it wasn't just Kyle who felt the pressure. Marcus, too, was navigating a minefield of his own. As the new captain, he knew he had to act decisively, not just to deal with Jameson, but to begin the long and difficult process of reforming the department. He had inherited a precinct that was deeply divided, with entrenched systems of power and loyalty that would not be easy to dismantle. In private meetings, Marcus laid out his plans for reform. He spoke of increasing community engagement, holding officers accountable for their actions, and creating a department that was transparent and fair to everyone, regardless of race or background. But not everyone was on board. Some of the older officers, who had spent years operating under the old system, resisted change at every turn. They saw Marcus as an outsider, a threat to the way things had always been done. Still, Marcus pressed on. He held meetings with community leaders, listening to their concerns and promising real change. He met with his officers, trying to instill a sense of purpose and integrity, encouraging them to rise above the toxic culture that had plagued the department for so long. It was a monumental task, and there were times when even Marcus doubted if he could pull it off. But he knew that the future of the precinct and the safety of the community depended on his success. Meanwhile, Kyle continued to grapple with his own role in the unfolding drama. He knew that speaking out against Jameson had been the right thing to do, but the consequences of that decision weighed heavily on him. Every day he walked into a department where he was seen as an enemy by many of his peers, and yet there was no going back. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Kyle sat in his car, staring out at the fading light of the setting sun. His thoughts were a tangled mess of doubt, regret, and a flicker of pride for standing up for what was right. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he began to see a glimmer of hope. If he could survive this, maybe, just maybe, he could help make the department and the community a better place. But as the protests outside the station grew louder and the pressure from within the department intensified, Kyle realized that the fight was far from over. The battle for justice, for fairness, and for change had only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, a sense of anticipation hanging thick in the air. For weeks, the city had been gripped by the scandals surrounding Officer Jameson's actions and the subsequent fallout. Now the trial was reaching its conclusion, and all eyes were on the proceedings. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised to capture every word, while community members crowded into the gallery, hoping for a glimpse of justice. Marcus Hayes sat at the front of the courtroom, his face calm but his posture rigid. This trial wasn't just about Jameson. It was about the culture that had allowed men like him to thrive within the department for years. It was about the unwritten rules that protected bad cops and silenced those who dared to speak out. For Marcus, this trial symbolized a moment of reckoning, not just for Jamison, but for the entire precinct. Across from Marcus, Kyle sat next to the prosecutor. His nerves were on edge, knowing that his testimony had been crucial in building the case against Jamison. He'd been through countless hours of questioning, both from the prosecution and the defense, each side probing every detail of that night on the street. The defense had tried to paint Kyle as an overzealous rookie, someone too naive to understand the nuances of real police work. They claimed he'd misinterpreted Jamison's actions, twisting the story into one of betrayal and overreaction. But Kyle had stood firm. His conscience had driven him to testify, to tell the truth about what he'd seen and what Jamison had done. He'd recounted in painstaking detail the moment when he saw Jamison plant the drugs in Marcus Hayes' car, the instant when everything changed. It had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, turning against a senior officer, someone he'd once looked up to, even if only out of duty. But now, as the trial neared its end, Kyle knew he had done the right thing. Whether or not the jury agreed remained to be seen. As the judge entered the courtroom, everyone rose. The atmosphere became even more charged as the final arguments were set to begin. The prosecution went first, delivering a scathing summary of the evidence against Jamison. They highlighted his history of misconduct, the internal complaints that had been swept under the rug, and most damningly, the testimony from Kyle and Marcus Hayes. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the chamber as they painted a picture of a man who had abused his power for years, a man who had finally been caught red-handed. When the defense attorney stood to make their closing argument, there was an audible shift in the room. They were fighting an uphill battle, and everyone knew it. Their strategy had been to discredit Kyle, to cast doubt on his motives and portray him as an ambitious young officer looking to make a name for himself. They argued that Jamison had been set up, that the drugs found in the car weren't planted by him, but were evidence of an entirely different situation, one that Kyle had misinterpreted in his zeal. But as the defense's argument dragged on, it became clear that the jury wasn't convinced. Too much evidence had mounted against Jamison, and too many cracks in his story had emerged during the trial. When the defense finally rested, the judge turned to the jury, delivering his instructions before they were sent to deliberate. For hours, Marcus, Kyle, and the rest of the courtroom waited. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Kyle stared at the door where the jury had exited, his mind replaying every word he had spoken during the trial, second-guessing himself. Had he said enough? Had he said too much? Would they see the truth in his testimony, or would they believe the defense's narrative? Marcus sat beside him, his presence a quiet reassurance. Though they hadn't spoken much since the incident, there was an unspoken bond between them now. Marcus knew what it was like to face the weight of an entire institution, to push back against a system that didn't want to change. In a way, they were both fighting the same battle, just from different positions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as they took their seats, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman stood holding a small slip of paper. Every eye in the room was on him as he handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge's voice cut through the silence. In the matter of Officer Jamison, on the charge of misconduct in public office, we find the defendant guilty. A collective breath seemed to be released from the room. For a moment, the weight of the decision settled over everyone, as if the intercity had been holding its breath. Marcus remained still, his face unreadable, but inside he felt a profound sense of relief. Justice had been served, and the truth had finally come to light. Jamison, sitting at the defense table, slumped back in his chair, his face pale. His once confident demeanor had crumbled over the course of the trial, and now in this moment of reckoning, he seemed smaller, diminished. The reality of his fate began to sink in as the judge scheduled a date for his sentencing. He would face real consequences for his actions, something he had long believed he could avoid. But the trial was only the beginning. While Jamison's conviction was a major victory, Marcus knew that real change couldn't come from just one case. The department itself needed to be overhauled. The culture that had allowed someone like Jameson to thrive had to be dismantled. It was a monumental task, but Marcus was ready for the challenge. The conviction was a signal that the days of turning a blind eye were over. In the weeks that followed, the department underwent a series of reforms under Marcus's leadership. New policies were put in place to hold officers accountable for their actions. Internal reviews were initiated, not just of individual officers, but of the department's practices as a whole. Officers were required to attend training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques, and a new system for reporting misconduct was introduced, one that protected whistleblowers like Kyle from retaliation. The changes didn't happen overnight, and there was resistance from within. Some officers, particularly those who had been close to Jameson, grumbled about the new policies, accusing Marcus of being too soft, of bowing to political pressure. But Marcus remained steadfast. He knew that the only way to rebuild trust with the community was to hold the department to a higher standard, to show that they were serious about transparency and accountability. As for Kyle, he found himself in an unexpected position. The rookie who had once been seen as a pariah for speaking out against Jameson was now being hailed as a hero in some circles. Community leaders praised him for his courage, for standing up to corruption when it would have been easier to stay silent. But inside the department, the reactions were more mixed. While some of his fellow officers respected him for his actions, others still viewed him with suspicion, unsure of where his loyalties truly lay. One day, not long after the trial, Marcus called Kyle into his office. The precinct was quieter than usual, the weight of recent events still lingering in the air. Kyle walked in, feeling a mixture of nerves and curiosity. He wasn't sure what Marcus wanted to talk about, but he respected the man deeply and was eager to hear what he had to say. Marcus gestured for Kyle to sit, then leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer for a moment before speaking. "You did something not many people would have the courage to do, Kyle," Marcus said, his voice measured but filled with sincerity. "What you did wasn't just about bringing down Jameson. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the whole world is against you." Kyle nodded, unsure of what to say. He still felt the weight of everything that had happened, and while he knew he'd done the right thing, it hadn't come without a cost. I didn't feel like I had a choice," he admitted. "I couldn't keep quiet after what I saw." "That's what makes you different," Marcus said, leaning forward. "A lot of people would have stayed quiet. You didn't. And because of that, you helped set this department on a path toward real change. It's not going to be easy, and there will always be people who resist. But we need officers like you. Officers who aren't afraid to stand up, even when it's hard." Kyle felt a surge of pride at Marcus's words, but he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with them. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was part of something bigger, something that could reshape the department and maybe even the city. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose that outweighed his doubts. As Kyle left Marcus's office that day, he knew that his journey was far from over. The precinct was changing, slowly but surely, and he would be part of that change. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. But Kyle was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the support of people like Marcus and the community behind him. Meanwhile, Jameson's fate was sealed. His appeal, filed in desperation, failed to gain any traction. The evidence was overwhelming, and the courts had little patience for his claims of being set up. He was sentenced to several years in prison, his reputation in tatters. The man who had once walked the precinct with arrogance and impunity was now a cautionary tale, a symbol of the corruption that had plagued the department for too long. The department continued to implement reforms, and under Marcus's leadership, a new era began to take shape. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of pushback, but the culture was shifting. Officers were being held to higher standards, and the community, once distrustful and angry, began to see glimmers of hope that things might finally be changing for the better. As the months passed, Marcus and Kyle found themselves reflecting on how far they had come. They often talked about the future, about the work still left to do and the battles they would continue to fight. But despite the obstacles, both men were optimistic. They had seen firsthand what could happen when people stood up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. In the end, it wasn't just about one corrupt officer being taken down or one department being reformed. It was about the belief that change was possible, that justice could prevail, and that integrity, no matter how hard it was to hold on to, would always win in the end. And that belief, more than anything else, was what gave them hope for the future.